On today's show, we have a look at how the media reports on climate change and environmental issues. Well, hello and welcome to Media and Society. I am your host, Naledi Muleo. This is, of course, the show where we take a look at the intersection between the media and society. Now, as usual, the show really isn't complete without your input, so feel free to give us a call over the next hour. The number is 011-714-0661 or 0662. Why don't you get onto Twitter and get in touch with us using the hashtag SABC Media Society. Let's get into our discussion this morning. Climate change, it stands as one of the most significant challenges of our time. It generates contrasting perspectives on its solutions and even its very existence. The media plays a vital role, of course, in enlightening, in instructing and maintaining a consistent alertness to ensure that matter receives the necessary attention. However, criticism arises as media outlets tend to heavily lean on occurrences such as conferences, climate-related disasters, and the publication of scientific studies for their climate change coverage. This approach poses a concern since it sidelines the daily concerns linked to climate change, such as continuous mitigation and adaptation, which might go unnoticed in reporting. These shortcomings are, of course, hugely concerning, given what scientists say lies in store for South Africa in the coming years. Well, as we take this discussion forward this morning, we are joined by Andiswa Matikinga, who is an investigative environmental journalist at Oxpeckers. Thank you so much for joining us. We're joined as well by Deborah Roberts, who is a leading climate change researcher. Mr. Adil Nchabeleng, an energy analyst, joins us in studio. We're also joined by Professor Colleen Vogel from Wits University. She's worked for environmental and local authorities for over 30 years, working at the Global Change Institute and Group Chief Executive at Whitford Group. Claire Keaton as well joins us. Claire, of course, is a Sunday Times journalist. And Michelle Mahaka from Africa Climate Alliance also joins us via Zoom. But let's start the conversation here in studio. Adil, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
You've got quite a tough job, don't you? In the sense that you are called on by media houses a lot of the time to speak about the energy crisis, which is highly politicized, yes?
Absolutely. I mean, when we talk about energy, it's a huge political issue today. And the way media reports it from a one-sided point of view. For instance, we have crises whereby energy affects communities. The shutting down of Komati power station and the devastation of the Komati, community itself, whereby people were left without jobs and opportunities. But at the same time, when media only reports, they only report the upside part of it, not looking at the devastation that it leaves behind. All in the mitigation for climate change, but not realizing that the impact it has on community is highly devastating. The jobs, the fact that we are one of the highest unemployment, country in the world, by the way, and with the highest levels of unskilled people who are living on grants and everything. So we're not doing much by using media to actually force policy change, because the role that media should be playing should be on the policy aspect of it, an aspect of ensuring that people's lives are empowered. Why we speak about energy, why we talk about the aspect of energy sovereignty in South Africa, and why we fought for the retention of some of the coal plants in South Africa is, if they were switching off all the coal plants, there was going to be a devastation.
Let me ask you to backtrack there, because perhaps we need to take a step back. For the sake of the viewer, why does the energy conversation become a climate change conversation, and what role does the media play? Let's take a few steps back here so that the viewer understands what exactly we're trying to get at.
You see, the role of energy is, energy contributes to almost 90% of what impacts on climate. The production, your fossil fuel, your mining of resources, your aspect of industrialization, the transportation element of it, the livestock, feedstock, as well as the aspect of actually bringing about agriculture and everything. All of it is all surrounded by energy. Our lives are energy based. Without life, without energy, there is no life. The heartbeat of everything in life is based on energy. So whatever we're going to do in life is going to be related to energy. And where energy comes into climate, it's its impact and its direct impact on the aspect of creating the CO2, which becomes the barometer by which we then manage the element of how do we migrate from fossil fuel, dirty energy based, to much more greener, environmentally efficient, sustainable energy solutions. And that's where media now plays the bigger role, and where energy becomes the anchor of the topic and the discussion. And there's two sides of it, by the way. On the one side, it says there must be this complete, almost devastation and destruction, closing down of power stations at rates that you can't even imagine. 12,000 megawatts at a given point, we are projecting that will be removed out of ESCOM. What are we going to be left with? There's then another side of it says that we must introduce renewable energy and green energy at the pace of which, where government does not even do anything. We don't have a smart city in the country. We don't have anything that is energy efficient. CSIR and all the other agencies that are supposed to have been building this infrastructure that we need to move from this economy, fossil fuel, green, dirty energy based and environmentally devastating, to much more greener, efficient, sustainable, electric lifestyle, electric car, working from home, mobility using digital technology. And that's not the case. Policymakers are only taking the one side part of it.
Yeah.
And the people who are using, for instance, people in academia and people in media, all they do is they write on the basis of who funds what interest. See, that's where the problem becomes. And we're not talking about the impact of people's lives. So I'm an agnostic on everything. I don't take sides. The green as well as versus the, dirty debates. I know both sides of it. I know the facts, and I understand what needs to be done. We need to move from what has been historically industrial, first revolution, second revolution based economy to a much more efficient economy where we can use resources correctly. We could produce an environment whereby in Africa, we can have your likes of Dubai, which is a green city today, using technology, empowering people's lives and giving them a great life. Not what is projected that then we must go back to an environmental efficient with no electricity, people walking on on grass and walking around in the so-called eco-Africa, where everything is just a zoo and a park.
Yeah, I wanna bring in some of our other guests because you're already getting to the end goal here, right? Which is fine because essentially we need to have vision. But let me bring in our other guests. Deborah, I'm going to start with you and ask you, okay, your assessment of how the media actually treats the climate change versus energy discussion in South Africa. I mean, if you were to rate us from a 1 to 10 of just how critical we are of these discussions and how important they are we giving them the attention they need? Are we as analytical as we need to be?
And good morning to everyone who's watching. If I were to rate the media, I'd probably give South African media a 3 out of 10. There tends to be this obsession with extreme events because I think those are headline grabbing. But I think Anil is correct. That unidimensional view of the role that climate change plays in the world is a very dangerous one. We live in a world of many crises, of polycrises. And for many people, particularly in Africa and indeed South Africa, there are much more immediate crises at hand. There are existential crises about where the next meal might come from, the ability to educate one's children. And so I think that the science is really pointing, and this is where I would disagree with some of the previous statements, is pointing to the fact that we actually have to do it all together. That we have to think about ambitious mitigation that move from fossil fuel powered energy to green energy. We've got to do it in a way that allows us to reduce vulnerability of our populations. Africa has some of the most vulnerable populations in the world, but we have to do it under the overall umbrella of reaching sustainable development. And within that, the biggest pandemic is inequity. We simply can't make these transitions in a manner where we leave anyone or any place or any ecosystem behind. And I think that's the real challenge for policymakers, is we can't just be addressing climate change in and of itself. We have to be addressing it within a broad developmental context and bringing society with us. And so we really need to be asking the climate question of every aspect of our lives. And so instead of focusing on those extreme events, which admittedly grab the headlines, we need to be talking to people about what this transition means, both the challenges, which are very real, as indicated, but also the enormous opportunities that exist in making those those transitions. Because if we do not transition our economies, the world is moving to a much greener baseline, which means our economy will be excluded. We simply do not have an option. We will have to transition. The question is, how do we bring everyone with us in an equitable and just way? And I think that's the real challenge for policymakers. Have we moved fast enough? Absolutely not. Will we have to? There's absolutely no question we will be left behind. And that would be disastrous for our society, for our continent and our economy. So the question is, how do we put all of these challenges together, poverty and equity, climate change, biodiversity loss, increasing health challenges, to create a more sustainable society? And I think that's the big thing. We have to do it all, and we have to do it now, all together. And that really is the key challenge of the 21st century.
So at the top of your answer there, Deborah, you started with the media sitting at a 3 out of 10 in your view. And I want to sit with that a little bit, because a part of me feels that over the past 20 years, the way that we have had the public discussion around climate change certainly has changed from a public platform point of view. 20 years ago, we talked about, well, not littering and being more responsible for our environment. Now it seems that the media conversation around climate change is becoming very political. So let's talk a little bit about why you put us at 3 out of 10 and how we can improve that.
Well, I think it goes to the point I made. I think the media, like many elements in our society, is focused on success. What sells media in its broader sense, be it virtual or paper-based, the more traditional media, are those headlines that grab attention. And there's often a saying in the community I work for, don't waste a good disaster. Disasters attract attention, those critical moments where newsworthy stories emerge. But the problem is, and I think Anil indicated this, it's a more day-to-day challenge, which is besetting us. We're talking about a change in development path. That's simply not as sexy as a devastating event in terms of headlines. Yeah. And I think that's where the media could enable a broader-based societal discussion, for the people who need to see jobs in their future, who need to see the ability to bring their children to school, to provide food for their families. Yeah. What are we actually talking about in terms of that transition? So I think it's the move away from dropping in when we have the disasters to a broader developmental debate that the media, I think, could be more supportive of. Yeah.
Let me bring in Professor Colleen Vogel from Wits University. Prof, good morning to you. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Your assessment of also just how knowledgeable the media really is in telling the story of the climate change versus energy global disaster that we seem to be dealing with, right? Because there's always the argument of how well the media is doing, but as someone who researches this field, what do you make of the quality of content that's coming out of media and what they're able to feed people?
So, I concur with the previous two speakers and in particular with Deborah. So I've been working in this field for about 30 years. And in the beginning, when we worked on climate change, much like what Deborah was saying, we focused a lot on impacts. We literally just kind of took the climate event and looked downstream. But now, as we've included more and more social scientists, civic practitioners and others, the debate is much, much wider. And I think Deborah's key point is that I'm getting a bit of an echo. Is that okay? I'll carry on.
Do carry on. Thank you.
Thank you. Is the vulnerability. It's showing, so I use a simple analogy. You've got a table decked with everything and a tablecloth on top of that. When you strip that off, like an extreme event, say a flooding event, what you expose is what's been going on in society on a daily basis. So the developmental failures or the developmental advances. And I think where we are moving, I think media is getting better, but we need to move much, much more strongly, is that we captured either by the disaster event, like Deborah said, or it tends to be very biophysically focused and very technical. So ocean acidification or greenhouse gases, it's a very inaccessible language for many readers, including the scientists, I might add. Some of us have to sit with dictionaries when we're doing the IPCC and other things. And we plea for making it more, not simple, because it's complex, but making it much, much more accessible. And so for me, I think media is being too constrained as well. What about the arts? What about drama? What about social blogging? What about entrepreneurial skills that our youth are needing? We tend to be still quite narrow, and I go back to my initial comment. It's very much driven by where our state of the science is. Now our state of the science, I think Deborah will agree, is huge. It's wide. It's really wide. We're going into ethics, psychology, brain, consciousness, all kinds of things. But I think where we're missing a trick is actually making these messages credible, number one, and being honest brokers. What can we really say with a fair amount of legitimacy and credibility that actually should be highly credible?
Yeah.
And then how do we help and work together? I think Deborah made that point, which is really critical.
Yeah.
Not only educating, as I'm involved in, but working with practitioners and others to make the challenge of this time, because we're losing time now. The window's closing. But we need to be careful of the paralyzing messages that sometimes come out, and rather showing where each of our actions, development actions, and in particular, not letting policymakers off the hook, that the developmental practice that we should be doing every day should be mirrored in onto that table, so that when the tablecloth gets ripped away by a flood or a heat wave or a whatever, we can point to the policies and the efforts that we were doing anyway. Because these are, insidious challenges that become, I don't want to use the word tipping point, but they reach a threshold and then they exacerbate. Okay. So we really need to be doing a lot more nuanced work.
You're making an interesting point about just how targeted we have to be in telling the story. And I think I'm going to bring Michelle in here from the Africa Climate Alliance, because there is something to be said about just, what in the African context is important information to be shared about climate change. And I keep mentioning how it is also an energy conversation. So Michelle, come in here and talk to us about what the African perspective really should be from a media point of view, right? There's the argument that has come out of the last COP conversation, the last COP conference, for instance, about how Africa only contributes about 4% of carbon emissions to the globe. And yet we are becoming a great part of the responsibility that has to turn things around. Is that a conversation that we should be having on a public platform?
100%. But in addition to that, we also need to be looking at South Africa, right? Not just the African continent, because when you switch those numbers around and you start looking at Africa, South Africa, it becomes very interesting. So that 3% starts to look like more that South Africa is doing. But before I address that specifically, there is something that we need to realize, and we need to name it, because when we do that, we're able to move forward more honestly, like we've been hearing. So there are vested interests in coal already, and that is making this transition that we speak about, the just energy transition, or just transition, which looks at making sure that no one is left behind. Everyone in our society is able to be brought along into this new economy that serves everyone, that is more sustainable, that is greener, that looks at clean energy. When we start to mention things like there are current vested interests in coal and that's stalling this move, even from a governmental perspective, we start to have more honest conversations. And I think that's one of the things that the media needs to look at. And then moving on to what the media's role actually needs to be. I think one of the issues that we see is that the media is attempting to report from an outsider's perspective looking in, when in fact the media needs to not only be a friend to the movement, but be part of the movement, the climate justice movement. And when that happens, we start to come up with questions like, who do we want to speak to? What do we want to speak about? And when we do that, what is the change that we want to see? Because media is one of the most influential players in our society, and it's completely underutilized, especially when we start talking about climate reporting. Yeah. So coming back to your first question about how the kinds of conversations we need to be having. We need to be having this conversation about energy, right? It's very, very important, because when we speak about climate issues, we're also speaking about a justice movement. And for me, that's where I like to use things like climate justice, or just justice in general. Because when we say climate reporting, a lot of the times we're alienating people.
Yeah.
We're stopping to speak to the regular person on the ground, because already as things stand, we're not speaking to that person. So what do we want to speak about? Who do we want to speak to? And what do we want to come out of it?
Okay.
So when we start speaking about things from an African perspective, I don't really think it's about wanting to go back to walking on grass, right? Or having this pre-colonial Africa. I mean, things have changed. We are way past that point.
Yeah, I think part of the discussion, though, particularly in media, has not been around wanting to go back to our natural old environment. It really is about a developmental issue, right? And let me bring Claire in here quickly, because Claire, you really have the responsibility of writing these stories, number one, which is technically difficult, politically charged, and also wanting to really buy the hearts of the reader. Are we, as the media, playing sides when we start talking about climate change and its impact on Africa's development and its energy crisis?
So thank you. Good morning to everyone. I agree 100% with the assessment of where the media is at. I think we are failing to do our job. And I also want to put a context to that. So we're working in an industry that is it's struggling for its own survival. And things that I want to write about that people can relate to in terms of climate. How does your transport work? What about pollution of your water sources, your health, food security? All of those things are really struggling to compete with politics, corruption, headline disasters, etc. It's incredibly hard to get the space for that. So we need to find a way to take those stories to people, what they want to hear about, what they can relate to, and that it's not all bad news. So to find a way that people can actually connect is a real challenge.
Yeah.
I think there is more reporting now, and I just want to say in response to your first speaker, I don't think policy is being imposed from the top. I sat in a presidential climate commission where there were women's representatives, religious, youth, unions, etc., talking about the just energy transition. So this idea of it just being imposed without trying to take people along, without trying to look at how to reskill people for new jobs in a green economy. I think that's a simplistic version, but I think it's incredibly challenging because of the inequity, because of our context.
Yeah.
But we are committed, that I can say.
Yeah. Andy, so I'm going to bring you in here. Andy So is, of course, an investigative environmental journalist at Oxpeckers. Where are we right now in understanding how the media actually translates the story of climate change? And, earlier we got a rating of 3 out of 10 in the conversations that the media is having. But there's a concern here that there is a push and pull, that there's a tug of war about just how much responsibility Africa needs to take for climate change and how the media actually reports on it. Welcome back. You're still watching Media and Society with myself, Naledi Mola. We're discussing this morning media coverage of scientific topics, particularly climate change, and really how the media influences public perception and also policy decisions around what Africa and South Africa really positions itself as in the climate change discussion, and also what it means for our energy crisis. We're still in conversation with Mr. Adil Nchabileng, energy analyst, Professor Colleen Vogel from Wits University, who's worked for local organizations and international for over 30 years, working at the Global Change Institute, Group Chief Executive at Whitford Group, Claire Keaton, and Sunday Times journalist Michelle Mahaka from Africa Climate Alliance as well. Adil, let me bring you in here. It seems that this is actually a particularly difficult discussion to have, right? Because once you start talking about how the media reports on climate change, it becomes very much about educating the public. But there's a conversation that I think we're not having here about the politics of energy, particularly in this time frame that we're in, where Africa has decided that it's not going to enter the climate change discussion without some commitment from the West, correct?
Absolutely. And that's why, the last trip that President Ramaphosa made in France, where he actually explained to the French, it was a climate funding conference and summit. In there, he says, look, we were told and we were encouraged to go along the path of actually, divesting out of coal and investing into green alternatives. Money was actually placed on the table, which was supposed to have been delivered and has not been delivered. So there is dishonesty by global leaders as well as the institutions, particularly the agencies behind the scene that are running the advocacy for climate change and climate advocacy. The other thing is, I find particularly bizarre is you don't have an honest conversation. When you talk with media on climate, the minute you are questioning some of the climate fundamentals, for instance, they say South Africa, it's 1% global contribution on greenhouse gas emissions, 1%. When you start questioning that in our 1% contribution, it's definitely not that great and significant. Why must we destroy the basis of our infrastructure at the basis of making sure that we can fulfill some of the ambitions that are already set for 2050, which we could gradually grow into? Suddenly it becomes a tense. You are told an anti-this and an anti-that. And there is no actually two conversations going on, or even multipolar conversations that speaks about those that are in support and those that are saying that some of the assumptions and the climate are not necessarily accurate, And there's been questions, for instance, from the IPCC point of view, in terms of saying 96% of scientists, there is no such an assumption in the world. You can't tell me 96% of global scientists came together and agreed on a particular point of view. Then you come on the other side. There are other, scientists who are not necessarily agreeing. As I said to you, I'm an agnostic. I don't believe in either or. I believe in all values that we must bring together as views because you enrich conversation.
Yeah, you're reminding me of when former President Donald Trump, argued that there's no such thing as climate change, which was a big statement to make, but it became a media uproar.
And he divested out of the Paris Climate Accord. So some of those things is where we are asking the question, for instance, yes, it's an issue for our time. It's a major catastrophic challenge in terms of our environment. At the same time, we are the least emitter in South Africa. Yet we are expected to be the best showcase for showing any country that must be punished against emission. To say, cut down everything that you have to do with your basis of your minerals complex, your coal, your mining, your industrial capacity. And if you have actually observed over the last 10 to 15 years, South Africa has shut down over 104 main smelters. I'm talking industrial scale smelters that used to employ thousands of people. We have shut down refineries. We have shut down foundries. These are all steel and coke and steel based industries, right? We've shut down all our industrial complexes everywhere, manufacturing and everything. And now we are an Amazon take-a-lot economy. People come in and bring goods, and we are the net importers of everything. Yet we should have used the opportunity for climate change in order to revitalize our industry. Instead of importing, we could be locally producing. Media never speaks about that. Media never holds politicians accountable in respect to their role and responsibility to society. Media only goes with the one view, which is a binary view, that says that only topics that are green supporting should be encouraged. So when I come in and say, guys, we need energy in the form of coal, in the form of fossil fuels such as your gas, in the form of nuclear, suddenly I've said a swear word. They mute you and you get censored because nuclear as the most greenest, most energy efficient, most unpolluting, it's a net zero energy. Nobody wants to talk about it because why? You're an African country which should not even entertain nuclear. Only in the West where they can go in hundreds of megawatts of nuclear energy. But you're not responsible enough as Africans to debate the issue of actually starting up nuclear reactors, nuclear science, nuclear technology, nuclear medicine.
Let me talk to the media practitioners that we have on the panel. Andy, so I think we have you now. Andy, so of course, is an investigative environmental journalist at Oxpickers. Andy, so your view on what Adil is saying, has Africa and South Africa media particularly become a playground for a tug of war over just what energy decisions we need to be making? And is the media really, I suppose, being responsible with that massive responsibility that we have?
Thanks for the question, Naledi, and I'm so sorry for my tech glitches earlier. I think Adele and some of the experts had a good point when they rated us a 3 right at the beginning, and there is some truth to what Adele is saying, depending on which media house you're speaking to and what the agenda is. But I think it's very important as media to keep to the basics and the ethics of reporting, which is being fair and factual at all times. And I think that's the best way to achieve impartiality or to achieve getting the message across, whatever the message is. So I think from our point of view, for the media house that I'm with, for us it's not to push a certain agenda, but we are an environmental journalism unit. And for us, the focus is on environmental journalism. It is basically showing what is going on the ground, what are the environmental issues that people are facing, and perhaps it's not to promote industry, promote nuclear or everything else that Adele has said, because we need to be honest about the impacts of those as well. I mean, just looking at nuclear on its own, it is a non-polluting source of energy, true, but we do also need to factor in the negatives. And once those start happening, who is impacted and who is affected? The people on the ground, and that is what our reporting usually focuses on.
Yeah, let me ask you this, Sandiswa. Are we, as the media, making the link between climate change and energy, particularly in South Africa, where we're a country that every now and then we're hit with stage 6 load shedding, and then we're reminded that we need to move to renewable energy? So as the media, do we in our storytelling link climate change to energy as often and as concisely as we should for the public?
To be honest, I really don't think fellow media houses are doing enough to link the two. And as you said, I think we're very reactionary a lot of times when it comes to reporting such topics. But we need to ever so often continue to make the link between the two, because as it has already been mentioned earlier, the two are intertwined, they are interlinked. If we look at perhaps the fact that we had envisioned more load shedding or higher stages of load shedding during this winter, but it was again renewable energy that came in and actually reduced the impacts of load shedding or the stages of load shedding that we got to experience because of the energy that has been harnessed from renewable energy or wind farms across South Africa. So we need to be telling those stories. We need to be vocal about those as well, and not just reporting on energy as something that falls on its own and climate change as something that is on its own as well, because the two are intertwined. They are interlinked. I think I just want to go back to the point of the shutting down of power stations as well.
Yeah.
If we look at that, it just so happens that it coincided with the just energy transition, but a lot of the power stations or the life of the power stations is coming to an end, and that is why we're now talking about decommissioning, and that is why we have these climate goals for 2030, for 2050, as well as the just energy transition, and they now coincidentally form a part of that. So that's another way of linking it to climate change and letting people know that that is what's happening.
Yeah.
So I think with a lot of the reporting that we've done on the ground with people, where we've been to Komati and people were not so receptive of the just energy transition, the misinformation that was on the ground was that this just energy transition is the cause of Komati shutting down.
I see Adil shaking his head as you say that essentially our power stations are reaching the end of their lives, and that's another discussion altogether. But Claire, I'm going to bring you in here as a journalist for the Sunday Times. Do we have a problem of climate change, misinformation and propaganda? And does it matter which media house you work for? I think that really is the bigger question. I mean, is there a discussion that we need to be having in this country about which media houses report on climate change and energy and make the links between the two?
Okay, so I'm going to talk from my own perspective, first of all. At my media house, there's no pressure from editors saying you must or mustn't take these points of view. It's very important for us to tell stories from the point of view of our readers and people on the ground. And that's what we are trying to do, to make those connections to jobs, to clean air, to clean water, things that actually really matter to people's lives. of course, there are multiple points of view. We're trying to make sure that as many people as possible get to voice those points of view, because it's not a one-sided debate. And we've got to look at the broader context. Just to come back to what Deborah said, it's about justice and equity. And that does not mean just sticking with coal. In fact, there seem to be a lot of vested interests at the moment in promoting nuclear, coal, etc., that I'm seeing across platforms. I'm not saying there aren't two sides to the story, but I do think we need to look at stuff in context and give voice to the people who are most affected, as well as at the policy level.
Yeah.
And I can't speak for other media houses, but I think there is increasing reporting, and I think there's increasing misinformation.
Yeah.
And we need to be clear about that.
Yeah, Deborah, I'm gonna bring you in here again, and I think you started there with giving the media 3 out of 10, which is, I sit with that because it's quite a harsh criticism, right? Is this a conversation that, in your view, as you watch how the media reports on it, speaks above the heads of the everyday South African? Are we talking over people's heads? Do they even understand the impact of the conversation that we're having?
Thanks, Naledi. And someone who comes from the scientific community, I'd be equally self-critical. So if you had asked me to evaluate the ability of scientists to communicate their science, I'd probably give us a 2 out of 10.
Yeah.
If you look at the IPCC reports we've just produced, the 3 main assessments, those come in at about 9,000 to 10,000 pages across the 3 main assessment reports. I know of no policymaker who has the time to read 9,000 to 10,000 pages. The figures we use also in the scientific literature are just incomprehensible to most normal people. I certainly can't use it when I talk to my policy colleagues. So I think there's a real challenge to science, and here I would really challenge your deal. The science is extraordinarily clear. The global warming of 1.15 that we're already experiencing, we can directly tie to human activities. There simply is no debate anymore. The physical evidence is there, but the problem is communicating the science in a way that people can relate to, that impacts on their day-to-day lives. There's definitely a gap between the science and society in that regard. We are getting better, but so much more needs to be done, which is why I think a partnership between science and media is really important, because as all of us have said, from our different perspectives, this is not a place where you've got one silver bullet which will solve this problem. It is an extraordinarily complex societal problem. And there are no easy answers left. If you look at the ambition that we have to have as a society to achieve 1.5 degrees of global warming, that requires net zero by 2050. And in all the scenarios we use, for example, because colleagues have called out nuclear, you have got to use nuclear of some form. But there are challenges related to that. So we must have a broader societal debate about how we tackle these polycrises and the difficult solutions that are out there. And that's why I think the partnerships, between society, media, and science can provide those platforms.
Yeah, and that's
really
negotiate
some of these really
that's really what
challenges.
I want to come back to when we come back from this break, and really look at where the opportunities are then for those partnerships, right? And when we come back, I'm going to ask Professor Colleen Vogel from Wits University to talk to us about where the opportunities are then from academia, then to partner with policy writers and government, and then the media, so that we're having a really clear discussion that does not look like a tug of war. Welcome back. You're still watching Media and Society. Climate change is, of course, having a devastating impact on the most vulnerable people in the world. And this morning on Media and Society, we're talking about just how the media then reports on climate change. And are we having the right kinds of debates and conversation on public platforms where you are able to really understand what policymakers are doing, right? Taking some calls, 011-714-0661. I'm going to bring Professor Colleen Vogel in here from Wits University. Prof, we talked earlier about the partnership that's necessary. I think one thing that COVID certainly taught us is that we need to listen more and more to our scientists and to academia. How do we start to smoothen that partnership where you've got the right information being shared with policymakers and the right information then being shared with the public on mainstream media?
Thanks very much. I just want to make a couple of points. I think the focus on energy alone is problematic because we really need to be looking at energy, water, and food and how those are interconnected, and then plus all the others. So that then takes us into the adaptation mitigation space. I think your point, most of us who are working in academia are not just working with policy, we work across the practitioner space, and that's critical. So there are formal and informal coalitions, groups, alliances that are already working. I'm working a lot with youth. There's the National Business Initiative one can connect to. There's the climate justice initiatives that are happening in the country. But I also want to bring in a point that I think we really need to be very mindful of. As Deborah said, and I've also been exposed to the IPCC that does a wonderful job, but if we're not communicating this into the everyday lives of people, we're missing a huge, huge opportunity. And there are ways of us doing that. Innovation. There are lots of people working on innovative methods, and we're not reaching out to that media. So I think it's not only the, if you like, newspapers and the television medias. We need to be bringing in the artists. On Friday, we met with a bunch of chefs and food groups who are doing amazing work in local communities, trying to raise awareness. So I would just urge us to think about formal and informal, to press on those alliances. We can give you connections if you want on those. I think Claire already has reached out to some of us on this forum to start small. We can start already, but there are a lot of efforts going on. I think the problem is to find those connecting points and to ensure that the discussion is not only just a binary, although it's critical to energy, but to see that multifaceted nature, and then where does climate justice fit into that? What does it mean for everybody? And it's not just the voice of the academics. Thank you.
And I think just to, unfortunately, there's very little time on the show, it seems, even though we have an hour. But I'm going to bring in, I'm going to bring you in here and say, are we having a situation in this country, and how do we get past it, where even in the mainstream media, there seems to be an antagonism and protagonism between climate change activists and politicians?
Exactly. Look, it's driven mainly by the narrative shapers. One is academia, one is media. And we're now facing a situation whereby academia today is acting like medieval universities. Academia universities are acting like medieval churches. You say something wrong, you get actually chopped, and media becomes now the executioner. You become now paraded, and you can actually... So we need to have honesty. Justice comes with honesty and accountability and openness. And we need to say it, give everybody. Social media, by the way, has done an incredible amount of work where you have diverse views. Even Twitter changed its attitude. Those that were at one point against climate change, who were not given the space, who used to be censored, are uncensored today. But at the end of it is, we've all agreed that we have to transition. We cannot live in a polluting environment. We cannot live in a polluting economy and a society. But there is no honesty to it. I have a village. Climate change and climate justice, if it was that impactful in terms of its work, my village today in Khanchabeling in Skukuni should have been one of the catalyst projects that shows that you can live in harmony with the environment, using energy sustainable, people living and thriving in that ecosystem with all the technology provided that are eco-sensitive. What is that? Why is it not happening? Because nobody is held accountable. The politicians are actually just playing lip service, going on international conferences. You have media on the one side being funded in order to promote the just transition, but not delivering in terms of the equitable value and its dividend by government to its citizens. Poverty is a reality. That is why we're saying coal, we cannot migrate out of it, because it's an issue of bread and butter for most of us. Okay? Nuclear. We are regarded as one, we must not go into nuclear because Africans are going to be irresponsible with handling nuclear, because they associate nuclear that we're talking about with a proliferation, which is arms-based and military, which is not the case in South Africa and most African countries. We're talking about nuclear for thermal energy to produce electricity that produces energy that is green. So the debate has to open up, and we have to crack the shell, use social media. Something like WhatsApp has done more incredible work. Telegram, there is now a vibrant, and even this new popping up YouTube debate platforms where they don't even allow you on YouTube, people go on to Rumble.
I think this,
and that's alternative media now.
The point that I think you're trying to get to, and I think is important, is making this conversation more accessible.
Richer.
Right, more accessible and richer. And that's why I want to give Michelle the last bite here as the Africa Climate Alliance and say, okay, your message to media houses, not just in South Africa, but certainly in Africa, where we're able to make the discussion around climate change and its link to energy more accessible? What's the wording you want to see more of as we have this discussion, Michelle?
So before I just go into that wording, I want to say that there's a very useful tool that is at the media's disposal, and it's called a climate reporting guide, a guide for South African media by a group called Fossil Free South Africa. I think it'd be so interesting for media practitioners to go and check out that tool. It's incredible because it's a guide on how to report on climate issues specifically in South Africa. And then when it comes to what I really want to see, I think it's all been said already, right? I want to see reporting that speaks to people, that speaks to truth, that does not, push one agenda. And that's something that we see a lot, is that we are not truthfully representing a lot of the stuff that's happening, and the truth when it comes to this energy debate, where at the moment, I feel like we're having so many conversations at once, where this could have been, a lot more focused. So those are just some of the things. And when we really want to speak to people, we need to speak their language, right? We speak about simplifying messaging. It doesn't need to be too complex. It needs to be in normal languaging. Some of the work that I do is to make sure that climate resources are accessible. And you find that there's so much that people have to offer if they understand what the conversation is about. So from a media's perspective, I think it would be so useful and so valuable for us to not only look at facts, but also to communicate that in ways that are not anxiety-inducing. And that's where this conversation around climate doomism comes in, because when we do that, we are paralyzing entire nations, and we really just need to speak about what's currently happening and what it is that we can, work toward, the kinds of solutions that we need to be thinking about. So those are just some of the things, just a caution to not focus on these headlines that are money grabbing or attention grabbing, but really speak to the truth and what we can do as societies, and steer away from the doom and gloom of it all. Because I think there's so much more opportunity for us to develop solutions when we are a lot more positive toward the future that we want to build.
Yeah, I quite like that, because essentially what you've said to the media is, let's stop being apocalyptic, but really scientific, and give the public really the nitty-gritties of what's actually going on. Thank you so much for speaking to us. I appreciate all of our guests this morning. Thank you so much to Andy Swamatikinga, investigative environmental journalist at Oxpeckers, Deborah Roberts, who is a leading climate change researcher, Mr. Adil Nchabeling, an energy analyst, Professor Colleen Vogel from Wits University. Thanks as well to Claire Keaton from Sunday Times, and Michelle Mhaka from the Africa Climate Alliance. A packed panel we had, and thank you so much for watching us. Have yourselves a great Sunday. We're back with you again next week.